I have spent most of my life around capital, and one truth becomes clearer the longer you stay in the room. Debt is not a moral category. It is a pricing category. That sounds simple, but it is one of the most misunderstood ideas in modern money. Most people were not taught to think about debt as priced capital. They were taught to think about it as virtue or vice. Borrowing was weakness. Paying cash was strength. Owing money was bad. Eliminating every liability was good. That language is emotionally satisfying and financially incomplete. A mortgage at 3% is not the same thing as a credit card at 24%. A fixed business loan used to acquire a productive cash flowing asset is not the same thing as financing a vacation, a watch, or an ego wrapped in leather seats. I do not admire debt for its own sake. I admire intelligent use of low-cost capital when the asset acquired is stronger than the cost of the money. That is a very different statement. And if you do not understand the difference, you can spend your entire life either fearing useful leverage or drowning in destructive leverage, while a quieter class of people uses the same banking system to widen control, compress time, and build assets that eventually work harder than they do. That is the real divide, not rich versus poor, not salaried versus entrepreneurial, not lucky versus unlucky. The deeper divide is between people who borrow to consume and people who borrow to control. The first group gets smaller. The second group gets larger. That is the whole subject. When I was young, I developed an almost unfair advantage because I discovered early that money had a strange property. Unlike labor, it could work while you slept. Unlike a salary, it did not need breakfast. Unlike reputation, it did not depend on the mood of the crowd. And unlike applause, it compounded. Compounding changed the way I looked at nearly everything. Once you understand compounding, you stop asking only what something cost you this month. You start asking what it costs your future options. You start asking whether a decision expands the machine or feeds the appetite. You stop admiring visible wealth and begin admiring productive structure. That same lens applies to debt. If borrowed money buys something that produces nothing, then the debt drains life from the borrower. If borrowed money buys something that produces cash flow, equity growth, pricing power, or other real economic value, then the debt can become fuel rather than drag. This is not radical. Large corporations know it. Real estate developers know it. Private equity knows it. Family businesses know it. Governments understand it when it suits them. Banks certainly understand it. The only people routinely told to treat all debt as one ugly blob are ordinary households, because confusion is profitable to the system. Let me say something even plainer. Banks do not hate debt. They manufacture it. They market it. They package it. They price it. They sell it to the uneducated at expensive rates and to the educated at strategic rates. That fact alone should tell you something. If debt were inherently evil, the most sophisticated financial institutions on earth would not spend their days extending it. No debt is more like fire. A family can burn its house down with it. A factory can power its engines with it. The difference is not the flame. It is the operator. Most people only encounter debt on the consumer side of the table. A loan for a car, a card balance rolled month to month, a personal loan used to patch a hole created by overspending. Debt feels like punishment. Interest becomes the tax paid for impatience. And because that is how millions experience debt, they conclude all debt must be a trap. That conclusion is emotionally understandable and financially disastrous. Because once you decide all debt is poison, you remove one of the few tools that can compress decades of asset accumulation into years, provided the terms are sane and the asset is productive. The wealthy do not avoid debt. They avoid stupid debt. They avoid debt that feeds vanity, weakens margin, and forces dependence on wages to keep up appearances. At the same time, they are often perfectly willing to carry cheap, long-duration, fixed-rate debt against assets that rise in value, throw off cash, or expand their ownership base. That is not hypocrisy. That is arithmetic. So let us begin where we should. Debt used for ego is financial poison. Debt used for acquisition can be financial leverage. Those two sentences sound similar, but they lead to entirely different lives. A man borrows $50,000 to buy a luxury vehicle because he wants to feel as though success has finally arrived. The vehicle depreciates, the payment remains, insurance rises, repairs eventually arrive, and each month the man services a decision that produces no return. The debt did not enlarge him. It made him more dependent on his next paycheck. Another man uses the same $50,000 as a down payment on a small property that can be rented at a level where the tenant largely carries the obligation, or he uses it to buy equipment that expands a service business with proven demand, or he acquires a digital asset with recurring revenue, or he purchases inventory for a business where turnover and margin are already demonstrated. The debt in this case is tied to an asset that has a chance to feed itself. Same bank, same legal instrument, completely different economics. That is why I always tell people to stop asking, "Can I afford the payment?" and start asking, "What does this debt control? And what does that thing return?" Consumers ask monthly, investors ask annually. That one shift changes more than people realize. The consumer sees a $700 car payment and thinks, "I can make that work." The investor sees $700 a month and asks, "What asset can I control with that same payment that could one day reduce my dependence rather than deepen it?" That is how financial maturity begins. Now, before anyone gets carried away, let me add the sentence that belongs right beside leverage every single time. Leverage is power. Over-leverage is collapse. This is where intelligent people often become fools, because the early experience of leverage can flatter them. The first deal works. The first tenant pays. The first property appreciates. The first refinancing looks clever. The first business expansion improves cash flow. And because success arrived, the borrower begins confusing favorable conditions with permanent skill. That is where empires fall, not from lack of ambition, from excess. Too much exposure, too little margin, too little humility. Leverage magnifies returns. Yes, it also magnifies mistakes, timing errors, refinancing pressure, liquidity gaps, and emotional weakness. If you borrow without cushion, then one vacancy, one missed payment, one weak quarter, one rise in rates, one legal dispute, one broken roof, one recession, one mistake in underwriting, and suddenly the thing that made you feel powerful becomes the thing that strips you of control. That is why I respect margin more than bravado. Margin is what separates strategic leverage from performative leverage. Margin means the debt obligation does not sit right on the edge of your life. Margin means you did not borrow the maximum the bank would allow merely because the bank allowed it. Banks lend based on risk models that protect the lender. They are not designing your peace of mind. They are designing their probability of repayment. You must be more conservative than the bank. If they approve you for $500,000, maybe the intelligent number is $350,000. If they say you qualify for 5 properties, maybe the right answer is 2. If the deal only works when nothing goes wrong, then the deal does not work. Hope is not structure. Structure is what remains when hope is unavailable. That is why I want cash flow before I want admiration. Paper appreciation is flattering. Cash flow is stabilizing. The person who borrows against something that only works if the price goes higher is speculating on exit conditions. The person who borrows against something that pays monthly, covers its obligations, and leaves spread after stress. Tested assumptions is building with a much firmer floor. Notice I said stress, tested. Most amateurs calculate gross income and call it yield. They see the rent and ignore the vacancy allowance. They see the sales and ignore the operating friction. They see the rosy case and never ask what happens when expenses rise 10%, revenue falls 20%, or a refinancing occurs at worse terms. Professionals do the opposite. They build around disappointment. They ask whether the spread survives ugly assumptions. That is the right instinct, because if your spread disappears under pressure, your control disappears with it. Let us talk about spread directly, because this is where debt stops being emotional and becomes mathematical. Spread is the difference between what your money costs and what your asset earns. If capital costs 6% and the asset yields 12 after honest expenses, your positive spread is 6. If capital costs 7 and the asset yields nothing except a story, your negative spread is 7. Lifestyle math compounds downward. Spread math compounds upward. That is why I prefer asking what my net positive spread is, rather than simply how much debt I have. Debt by itself tells me very little. $2 million of debt with $300,000 of annual positive spread can be a powerful structure. Zero debt with zero assets can be perfectly safe and perfectly stagnant. Safety without growth is not the highest financial virtue. Controlled growth with adequate safety is. Now add inflation to the picture, and things become even more interesting. Inflation is the tax most people. Groceries rise, labor rises, construction rises, services rise. People complain about the pain, which is natural enough. But one class of people experiences inflation differently. Asset owners with fixed-rate debt. That combination can be extraordinarily powerful because inflation quietly changes the real value of your obligations. Imagine a 30-year fixed payment that does not move while your rental income rises with the price level and the asset itself appreciates because replacement cost is rising. 10 years later, the payment is still nominally the same, but it feels smaller relative to rents, income, and the broader price level. You are effectively repaying yesterday's debt with tomorrow's weaker dollars. That is not trickery. That is the structure of a monetary system working in favor of the person who positioned properly. Now, this only helps if the debt is fixed and the asset is durable. Variable rate debt can turn inflation from ally to enemy very quickly. A floating obligation tied to rising rates can crush margin just when you thought general inflation would help you. That is why structure matters as much as the asset itself. Cheap, long-term fixed debt against a useful asset with pricing power is one thing. Short-term adjustable debt against a weak or speculative asset is another. People say they want peace. Fine. The correct debt structure can create peace because there is a very big psychological difference between waking up under a fixed obligation tied to a cash producing asset and waking up under a floating consumer burden tied to something that produces nothing. One structure grows easier in real terms. The other often grows harsher. This is one reason I have long said that debt is not just about amount. It is about terms, fixed versus floating, short versus long, self-liquidating versus salary dependent, matched to asset duration or foolishly mismatched. Those distinctions are where intelligence lives. A long-term asset financed with short-term debt can force terrible refinancing at the worst moment. A short-duration obligation on a long-duration slow, stabilizing asset creates timing risk that has ruined many otherwise reasonable ventures. Good operators match debt structure to asset structure. Bad operators borrow first and think later. This brings me to a related subject. People misunderstand deeply. Borrower positioning. There is a massive difference between asking a bank for money and having lenders compete to finance you. One position is weak. The other is powerful. Banks do not fear debt. They fear risk. Your job, if you intend to use leverage strategically, is to become someone whose risk looks controlled. That means your credit profile matters. Your liquidity matters. Your documentation matters. Your reserves matter. Your cash flow history matters. Your reputation matters. Your relationship with lenders matters. Your behavior with small obligations matters. Everything compounds. People look at a credit score and see a consumer number. I see leverage capacity. A stronger profile lowers cost of capital. Lower cost widens spread. Wider spread improves outcomes. That is not cosmetic. It is foundational. And no, this is not about worshiping banks. It is about understanding that cheap capital tends to flow toward people who look disciplined, stable, liquid, and repeatable. If you misuse credit early, if you max every line, miss payments, chase consumption, and then later ask the banking system to finance your productive expansion on wonderful terms, you should not be surprised when the answer is no. Credit is slow to build and fast to damage. Treat it like a financial reputation, because that is exactly what it is. I also care deeply about liquidity here. Banks respect borrowers who do not obviously need them. If you show up with no reserves, you look dependent. If you show up with 6 months or more of obligations covered in liquid assets, you look calmer, more stable, more bankable. That changes the conversation. And once a person reaches a certain threshold, lenders stop behaving like gatekeepers and start behaving like fuel providers. The psychological shift is enormous. You are no longer begging for permission. You are negotiating structure. That does not mean you borrow just because you can. Access is not obligation. The fact that a bank will lend does not obligate you to use the line. Discipline still rules. This is the part many people miss. Good leverage expands vision. Bad leverage expands appetite. The two can look similar in the first year and lead to very different lives by the 10th. Now let me turn to deployment, because access to capital means nothing if you place the borrowed money into static or weakening assets. Leverage belongs in compounding machines. Not all assets compound. Some merely sit there, some fluctuate, some appreciate once in a while, only a few truly compound through repeated income, reinvestment, and expanding control. This is why cash-flowing real estate can be powerful when bought correctly. Not because bricks are magical, but because monthly surplus can become seed capital for the next acquisition. That next asset creates another spread. The system expands, that is, compounding through controlled acquisition. Scalable businesses can do the same. A service system with proven margins, a software product with low incremental cost, a licensing model, a platform, a piece of recurring revenue intellectual property. These can compound because the reinvested surplus produces more surplus without equal increases in labor. Even dividend-producing investments can play a role. Though I am more cautious about borrowing directly into volatile markets unless the structure is exceptionally conservative. Volatility plus leverage can become an ugly teacher very quickly, but the underlying principle remains: capital deployed into things that produce repeatable cash is categorically different from capital deployed into things that merely flatter ego. The next distinction is simple and brutal. Amateurs consume profits. Professionals reinvest profits. That may be the most useful sentence in the entire subject. A leveraged asset producing $1,000 a month can become a wealth engine if the surplus is directed toward reserves, debt optimization, or the next productive asset. The same $1,000 can become nothing at all if it is translated instantly into nicer dinners, more travel, upgraded vehicles, and the whole exhausting theater of lifestyle expansion. That is where compounding gets murdered. Not in the spreadsheet, in the celebration. This is why debt is a psychological war long before it becomes a balance sheet problem. The math can be right, the structure can be right, the asset can be right, and if the operator is weak, the result still collapses. Debt amplifies character. If you are disciplined, it magnifies discipline. If you are greedy, it magnifies greed. If you are fearful, it magnifies fear. If you are impulsive, it magnifies impulsiveness. That is why I want emotional neutrality around debt. Not shame, not pride, not romance. Neutrality. Debt is not an identity, it is arithmetic. The wealthy are emotionally boring with money. That is one reason they often stay wealthy. They do not celebrate the loan as proof of importance. They do not dramatize the monthly payment as though suffering itself were a virtue. They calculate, they structure, they adjust. They also know when the role of debt should change. This is where maturity enters. Leverage is a phase, not a religion. In the early stage of wealth building, acquisition debt can be exactly the right tool. Later, optimization debt becomes the focus. Terms get improved, duration gets extended or shortened as needed, rates get reduced where possible, margin gets strengthened. Then, much later, debt can become optional. That is a beautiful stage, because the psychology changes. When debt is necessary, it feels heavy. When debt is optional, it becomes something you hold only if it remains economically favorable relative to peace, growth opportunities, and your life stage. I do not believe in eliminating all productive debt as quickly as possible, merely to say you are debt-free. That can be emotionally satisfying and economically mediocre. If a 4% fixed loan still sits below your realistic after-tax return on new productive assets, and your reserves and stress tolerance are strong, then rushing to eliminate it may simply be slowing your growth. On the other hand, if the spread disappears, if the rate has risen, if the asset weakens, if retirement approaches and stability matters more than expansion, or if the debt's psychological burden now outweighs its remaining financial usefulness, then deleveraging can be wise. The point is not dogma. The point is matching the debt strategy to the stage. Stage 1, debt accelerates entry and growth. Stage 2, debt gets optimized. Stage 3, debt becomes optional. That is a mature framework, not the simplistic slogans people love to shout. Of course, none of this means anything. If concentration risk is ignored, leverage magnifies concentration. If all your debt is tied to one neighborhood, one sector, one tenant base, one revenue model, one lender, or one economic assumption, then you are more exposed than you think. Exposure is not obvious while conditions are favorable. It becomes obvious when the market changes. That is why I respect diversification, but not the watered-down version, where people own tiny pieces of random things they do not understand. I mean strategic diversification from strength. First, you master one coherent system, then you expand into adjacent exposures that reduce correlation without destroying clarity. A residential rental operator may add a small commercial property. A business owner may add a digital asset or cash, generative securities. A portfolio dependent on one funding source may add another. Debt maturities can be staggered rather than clustered. Income streams can be layered. Skills can be diversified too, because knowledge itself reduces blind spots. The wealthy are not just asset diverse, they are knowledge diverse. That matters. The final question people obsess over is timing. Is this the right moment? Should I wait for rates to drop? Should I wait for prices to soften? Should I wait for the market to stop feeling uncertain? That is how people spend 5 years doing nothing while inflation, opportunity cost, and fear quietly tax them. I do not believe in timing the market with precision. I believe in timing your structure. If the structure only works in perfect conditions, the structure is weak. If it survives conservative assumptions in mediocre conditions, then the timing issue becomes far less dramatic. High rates do not automatically kill opportunity. Low rates do not automatically create good investments. Spread still decides. A 7% loan against a 12% durable yield can be far better than a 3% loan against a 2% weak asset. The headline rate is not the whole story. What matters is whether the deal cash flows under reasonable assumptions and whether you can survive bad phases without becoming a forced actor. Prepared investors often do their best work during fear, not because they predicted the fear perfectly, but because they built liquidity and structure in advance. Liquidity is what turns downturns into opportunities instead of emergencies. That is why I say timing rewards preparation more than prediction. And ultimately, if you keep doing this well, the whole game changes. At first, you are trying to replace some earned income. Then you are trying to increase productive asset income. Then, if you are disciplined long enough, you move into something more interesting. Systems start outgrowing your direct labor. That is where real power begins. Rental systems with management, businesses with process, digital assets with recurring revenue, investment income with reinvestment. Capital allocators think differently because their income is less dependent on daily labor and more dependent on structure. The goal is not simply to own more things. The goal is to build systems whose outputs are not fully dependent on your presence. That is where leverage has done its best work, not when it makes you look rich, but when it helps detach income from time. Eventually, if you keep going, you may reach what I think of as financial sovereignty, not just independence. Sovereignty independence means your income covers your life. Sovereignty means your structure protects your freedom even under volatility. That requires optionality, reserves, diversified cash flows, controlled expenses, emotional stability, and the ability to choose debt only when it is strategically optimal rather than emotionally attractive. That is a much higher form of financial life, and it depends on identity as much as it depends on tactics. People speak about money as though the tactics matter most. I disagree. Identity often dominates tactics. If deep down you believe wealth is built through calm structure, reinvestment, self-command, and strategic use of capital, then your behavior begins aligning with that belief. The broke identity reacts, the wealth identity allocates. The broke identity asks, how do I pay this bill? The wealth identity asks, how do I strengthen this system? The broke identity consumes relief. The wealth identity reinvests optionality. That shift must happen inside first. Otherwise, people make more money and still remain structurally poor because the internal operating system never changed. So let me reduce the whole thing to one blunt truth. Debt will not save a foolish person. Debt will not fix a weak identity. Debt will not make an undisciplined life suddenly elegant. But intelligently structured debt can help a disciplined person control more productive assets, compress time, widen spread, benefit from inflation, build cash flow systems, strengthen optionality, and eventually reduce dependence on labor. That is not fantasy. That is just the banking system used by someone who finally decided to understand it instead of fear it or worship it. The mistake ordinary people make is not that they use debt. It is that they either use it to consume or avoid it. So absolutely that they stay linear in a world where properly controlled leverage allows exponential ownership. Both mistakes are expensive. The answer is not recklessness. The answer is education, structure, margin, and restraint. Borrow for acquisition, never for ego. Respect spread more than style. Prefer fixed rate strength to floating rate hope. Protect margin with reserves. Build credit before you need it. Deploy capital only into cash, flowing or compounding machines. Reinvest before upgrading. Use debt aggressively in the early stages only if the structure survives stress. Refinance or eliminate intelligently as life stage changes. Diversify from strength, not confusion. Time your structure, not the headlines. Then keep going until the system no longer needs your constant presence to keep growing. That is how the bank stops being your master and starts becoming a fuel source. And if you can make that shift, you may discover something that most people never do. The problem was never debt itself. The problem was never the bank alone. The problem was not understanding what debt does in the hands of a consumer and what it can do in the hands of an owner. That difference looks small in theory. It becomes enormous over a life.